Hey history fans, welcome back to part 2 of Grade 8 Exam Review 2019. I'm Mr. Mills, I teach history. So we just talked about the Civil War factors and American factors, whether it be the Fenians or the Civil War itself, and we talked about economic issues going on for the British North American colonies. Okay? Coupled with these problems that the British North American colonies are trying to solve, especially in Upper and Lower Canada, now called Canada West and Canada East, Ontario and Quebec, is the idea of political deadlock. And political deadlock was when there's a stalemate in government. You had short-lived, ineffective minority governments. Nothing's getting done. Governments are elected, then they're defeated. And then there's an election, and then they're defeated again. Okay, so there's this sense in the United Province of Canada, made up of Canada West, Ontario, and Canada East, Quebec, that French and English tensions, in particular, are hurting the Union, and nothing's getting done. So what you had was minority governments. That's where you have most of the seats, or the most seats of any party, but you have less than half of the legislature. And let's take a closer look at how that works. That meant that certain parties had to team up with one another to... Can you go tell them to be quiet, please? Someone? As I was saying, you had French and English tensions, you had minority governments. Here's a look at the four main players. You had John A. Macdonald, the leader of the Liberal Conservative Party, who had to team up with a French counterpart, Georges-Étienne Cartier, who is the Parti Bleu. Now, Parti Bleu is why conservative colors today are blue. They were put up against the liberal side of things, which was on the English side, George Brown, right? And Antoine Dorion, the Parti Rouge, the liberal colors are red. Now, let's pretend this is the House of Parliament in the United Province of Canada. There's the Governor General on one side of the floor, on the other side of the floor, all the seats, right? In order for Macdonald, who's the most powerful politician, to get anything done, he had to team up with a French counterpart, who was Cartier, in order to control the House, meaning that to make more than half of the House blue, he had to enter into a coalition, right? And most of the time, this was about French and English on different sides of the political spectrum teaming up with one another. But these were very closely, evenly matched coalitions. So they could often defeat one another, which led to problems. This was called political deadlock, a stalemate where nothing is getting done. Another major issue, another major argument that was taking place within the Parliament was, how should elections take place? How should people be represented in government? Should it be equal representation, which is the way it was set up after the Constitutional Act, meaning that Canada West and Canada East got the same amount of seats no matter what the population? Remember Lord Durham, that's what he'd wanted, right? Meaning that even though at the time of the Constitutional Act, Canada East or Quebec had more people, they would be politically weakened because 50% of the seats would still be in Ontario, meaning that Ontario or Canada West would have inflated political influence. But over time, Canada West population outpaces Canada East. And people in Ontario don't find it fair that they have the larger population and still have the same amount of seats as Quebec. George Brown leads the rep by pop movement, representation by population. That is what we use today. It means that places with higher populations have more representation in Parliament. Macdonald favors equal representation because he knows in order to create this country, he's going to have to keep the French feeling valued and protected. Okay? And by giving them an equal number of seats with a smaller population, he does that. He can do that. Those are two very important arguments taking place. And what it leads to eventually, because of all this political deadlock, is it leads to a moment, a very famous moment in Canadian history, of the Great Coalition. And that, we watched that movie of John A., The Birth of a Nation, and a lot of that movie was about the relationship between Macdonald and Brown, which was quite poisonous. Brown does something very unselfish. He eventually crosses the floor, joins with Macdonald and Cartier, and gives a very clear majority where things can actually get done, right? It removes that political deadlock and things can move forward. And what do they pursue? Well, because of these factors, because of the fear of the United States, because of the economic concerns, because of issues like equal representation and representation by population, French and English relations, they start to come up with this idea of, well, what if we were a country of British North American colonies, right? And so they catch wind in 1864 of a conference going down in Charlottetown between the maritime provinces. And that conference is just to discuss, hey, maybe the Maritimes, we have similar economies, similar interests, similar cultures. Maybe we can join together and form a colony. Well, Cartier and Macdonald, they get wind of this and they decide to crash the party. They show up and they start saying, well, what if we built railroads together? We could trade with one another. We could defend more practically against the United States. We have cultural similarities, right? And so they crash the party and they say, what about something bigger than just a maritime union? And people think, well, that's actually a very interesting idea. Why don't we meet about a month later? And so they do. In October, they meet in Quebec at the Quebec Conference in 1864. This is where you get the 72 resolutions, many of them written by Macdonald. And what it does is it lays the framework for how this experiment of Canada would work. Strong central government. They finally agree that it would be representation by population. And the way that our democracy, our constitutional monarchy is set up is largely from these documents at the Quebec Conference. Okay? Very historically significant. John A. plays a very huge role in terms of making these. So they get that done, and a couple of years later, they got to pitch it to all the colonies. Not everyone's on board, really. PEI and Newfoundland in particular aren't very interested. And they meet in London, England, December of 66 and into the winter, early winter, February 67. And that is where the British North America Act is put together. This is basically the agreement for how Canada will come together as a country. It has to be passed by British Parliament, and it also has to be passed by the colonial parliaments. And eventually, on July 1st, 1867, with John A. appointed as the Prime Minister of Canada, Canada is formed as a country, and you get Ontario, used to be Canada West, Quebec, used to be Canada East, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia as the four original provinces of the Confederation. In the following units, we studied how the country grew geographically, how we ended up getting Manitoba, then BC, then PEI, and eventually the creation of Alberta and Saskatchewan. We look at that, but these are the reasons that things came together. It was almost like a perfect storm. Without the U.S. Civil War, maybe it doesn't happen. Maybe there's no impetus or urgency to do it, right? Without common economic problems and problems that needed to be solved politically, the question would be why, right? Why are we doing this? But it was done, and it grew into something very significant. And, you know, on Canada Day, when you celebrate and you're sitting around wherever you are with your family, you can explain to them why this happened and how it happened. And there you go. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. We'll see you later.
Let's hit